All right, welcome to the next reading of How to Lose a Planet, the Afro-Future epic. Starting with chapter 2 this time. Kato, Lacey, Simmons, and Bryan Ironside. A week before freedom, Kato Washington saw a petite white woman, gasped, and backpedaled toward the room's exit. His heartbeat clattered, but his escape was blocked by the belly of the prison guard behind him. His shackles jangled and reminded him of his status. He took a deep breath and lowered his head. He studied his raggedy shoes and knew that as soon as his brain sent the signal, his feet would work, would follow his brain's command and launch a first step toward the woman. But he didn't know if taking a step toward the woman would work. And during his incarcerated years, things that worked were the most important things. More important than money, more important than love, more important than truth. One of his best friends used to do drugs because, according to the friend, the drugs worked. A judge sent that friend to prison because the judge believed that prisons worked. Later, that friend gave up drugs for the church because the friend found that religion worked. To Kato, drugs meant downfalls, prisons felt like socially acceptable forms of torture, and religion was what slave masters once used to justify their abomination. But throughout the course of humanity, people tended to cling to what they thought would work. Unicorns for a child's bedtime story. Genocide for a better world. Some inmates believed that white supremacy worked, and those inmates, the Nazi inkheads who were already angry with Kato, would transition from angry to unleashed once they'd learned he'd been talking to an attractive white woman. He understood that inkheads used white supremacy because inkheads believed white supremacy worked, believed white supremacy made them strong, and their belief in the fantasy of white supremacy proved their weakness to Kato and their fear. The pack of wolves that appeared to be hunting was actually fleeing. But weak or not, fearful or not, the inkheads were many and Kato was one. So he was also afraid. And sometimes when he was afraid, he would have, because they worked, he assumed, spontaneous daydreams, something like a sneeze of the imagination, which he called brainstorms. He wished a signal would precede the brainstorms, a small detail warning him that for a few seconds his internal world would erase his external world. A twitch at the bridge of his nose, a brief clogging of his ears, an itch at the base of his skull, but there was nothing. This was why he missed the latest transition from his external world to his internal world, and now stood unawares amongst his latest brainstorm. He looked at the woman from the corner of his eyes, his prison uniform now a tuxedo, his head bobbing to the hip-hop flooding the room. The beat was playful as a puppy. Listen, lady. The chains fell off him like beads of sweat. He spun the chair on one of its legs, straddled it, sat, and leaned forward. First, take a deep breath. This is gonna hurt, even though that ain't what I want. Okay, she inhaled. I don't want to talk to your sightseeing ass, he said. First, it's dangerous. Second, I'm in no mood for translating the complexities of prison life, so you can be all, what, honey, you ain't never heard no slop at your next bottomless brunch. And then, damn, she screamed. Not out of despair, but anger. The walls cracked like glass. The guard dropped like a chopped tree, fetal position with his hands catching blood from his ears. The room shook like a subspace vessel fighting turbulence. And he heard her scream. But he heard the music too, a booster shot for the soul, and kept bobbing his head. She quieted. Perfectly understandable response. He adjusted his bow tie while holding a lowball glass of whiskey. I dig, because tourists ain't too bad, right? So why can't we be friends, or at least friendly? Her eyes had grown red. She nodded. I'm a good person. We can work together. But good ain't got nothing to do with it. Why not? We're just talking. He drank his whiskey and smirked. It's just not the right time for this. A large man appeared, standing behind the woman. His hair spread like a corona, a black star exploding from a brown scalp. His thick, tattooed arms were a totem pole on either side of him. Play the game, grandson, the man said. You may even find happiness at the end of it. Moses, Kato said. If I ever meant happiness, I expect there'd be a language barrier. If you ever meant happiness, grandson, I expect there'd be a funeral. Kato shook his head. He looked at the woman again. Actually, I would love to speak to you. His face threatened to twist into a scowl. Highlight of my day. He looked at his shackles and empty hands. He tried to remember how many years it had been since he'd had a whiskey or seen his grandfather. He accepted his return to the real world of battles in space and life on the moon and took his seat opposite the woman.